Part 1. January 15, 1919. Boston. At exactly 12:40 in the afternoon, the ground began to tremble. A sound rose that survivors would later compare to the roar of machine gun fire, a metallic scream, followed by silence, and then something no human eye was prepared to witness. A black wall, not of smoke, not of water, but of syrup, rose into the air. A monstrous wave of hot, sticky molasses surged down Commercial Street, swallowing buildings, crushing horses, splintering wood, and dragging people into its suffocating current. Witnesses swore it was as high as a three-story house, 14 meters tall, moving faster than any man could run. Within moments, 21 people were dead. Scores more lay broken, suffocating, or trapped. The city itself seemed drowned, not in fire or water, but in sugar. According to official records, it was simply an industrial accident. A poorly built tank, a warm day, a failure of engineering. But what happened next defies logic. Some believe the truth was buried forever in sealed archives, where reports do not match the testimonies of those who were there. This is the story of the Great Molasses Flood, a tragedy that Boston tried to forget, but which still leaves behind unanswered questions more than a century later. Prelude to disaster. To understand how such a surreal catastrophe could occur, one must begin with the hunger of an empire and the thick, dark liquid that fed it. Molasses. By the early 20th century, this sticky byproduct of sugar refining was far more than a kitchen sweetener. It was the raw fuel of a nation's industry. Fermented, it became alcohol. Distilled, it gave rise to rum. But more importantly, in the years leading up to the First World War, molasses was a critical ingredient in the making of industrial ethanol, the substance needed for military munitions. The United States Industrial Alcohol Company, known as USIA, had secured lucrative government contracts. The war in Europe demanded rivers of gunpowder, explosives, and fuel. Ethanol derived from molasses would supply it, and so, on the waterfront of Boston's North End, USIA erected a tank, a giant looming structure made of steel, 70 feet tall and 90 feet wide. Inside, it could hold more than 2 million gallons of molasses, enough to drown a neighborhood. But according to reports later unsealed, the tank was a disaster waiting to happen. Workers had complained of leaks. Neighborhood children brought cups to catch the dark liquid that trickled down its sides. Residents swore they heard groans and creaks, as though the iron monster were alive and straining. One engineer, Charles Gatley, wrote in his notes that the tank had been erected in haste without proper safety checks in 1915, barely inspected before it was filled to the brim. The steel walls were thinner than recommended, only half an inch in some places. Worse still, the seams had been riveted, not welded, creating weak points under constant pressure. But the war was raging, and contracts demanded fulfillment. So USIA ignored the warnings. By January 1919, the war was over. Prohibition loomed on the horizon. The final shipments of molasses would be converted to industrial alcohol before the law changed forever. The tank, filled almost to its limit, stood heavy and groaning in the chill Boston air. And then, on the morning of January 15th, the city awoke to unseasonable warmth. Temperatures rose from freezing to nearly 40 degrees Fahrenheit in mere hours. Pressure built inside the tank, mixing with the unstable cargo. According to official accounts, that was enough to cause disaster. But testimonies from witnesses, along with buried legal documents, hint at a stranger story: a city on edge. The north end of Boston was no stranger to hardship. Its streets were narrow, its buildings crowded, and its people, largely immigrants from Italy and Ireland, lived under the shadow of poverty. But the tank, the looming metal cylinder on Commercial Street, was something they had come to fear. Records from local papers show that parents warned their children not to play near it. Yet children always do. They gathered beneath the steel walls, pressing their ears to its side, swearing they could hear a low, endless rumbling, as though a monster were trapped inside. A resident named Bridget Clough, interviewed decades later, recalled, "We told them it was unsafe, but no one listened. You could smell the sweetness in the air, even in winter." The air itself was sticky. Company officials, however, dismissed the fears. Internal memos, later revealed in court, admitted that the tank leaked molasses like a sieve. The solution? They painted it brown so the leaking syrup would not show as easily. But there is a note buried in the archives of the Boston Building Department that complicates the picture. An inspector, name redacted, wrote only weeks before the disaster, "The tank is unsafe. The pressure is unnatural. Recommend immediate action." The recommendation was ignored. The day approaches. By midday on January 15th, life in the North End carried on as normal. Housewives hung laundry. Children skipped school to play stickball in the street. Dock workers moved cargo along the wharf. Horses clopped down the cobblestones, pulling wagons of lumber and milk. At 12:30, the elevated railway rattled along its track, steel shrieking against steel, shaking the neighborhood with its usual thunder. No one paid attention to the low groaning from the molasses tank. It had been groaning for years. But at 12:40, a sound came that no one recognized. A deep metallic roar, like the tearing of the earth itself. Eyewitnesses compared it to the report of a cannon or the crash of machine guns. The ground shook, and then silence. The silence lasted less than a second, because what followed was a nightmare. The first wave survivors told the same story. The tank split open with a shriek like a dying animal, and then it disintegrated. Steel plates, each weighing several tons, were hurled across the streets like shrapnel. The air filled with a thunderclap of rushing liquid. A wall of molasses, darker than oil, rose into the daylight, 14 meters high, moving at 35 miles per hour. It struck first the elevated railway. A train car was lifted from its track and flung into the air, passengers screaming inside. The steel beams twisted like toys. Then the waves surged down Commercial Street, smashing wooden houses into splinters, sweeping horses, wagons, and men into its suffocating grasp. One firefighter, trapped in his station on Causeway Street, recalled the moment. "It was as though the ocean had risen up black, and it carried us all away." Those caught in the flood described the same horror, the suffocation. Unlike water, molasses was thick, heavy, unrelenting. It filled mouths, noses, and lungs. It dragged bodies down, held them fast until breath was impossible. Even those who could swim found themselves paralyzed, their limbs trapped in syrup that hardened with each passing second. According to city records, 21 souls perished in that wave. But some researchers argue the number was higher. Unregistered immigrants, homeless men sleeping near the docks, unnamed children, their bodies never recovered, their lives uncounted. The aftermath. When the wave subsided, Boston's North End was unrecognizable. Buildings had been flattened. The ground was coated in a sticky layer 2 feet deep. Horses suffocated where they fell, their eyes wide in terror. Entire families were crushed inside their homes. The molasses hardened as the winter air cooled. Rescuers found themselves trapped in the same nightmare as the victims. Their boots stuck fast. Their hands pulled free only with a sickening snap of suction. Firemen hacked through hardened syrup with axes. Dogs sent to search for survivors became immobilized and had to be pulled out with ropes. The air was sweet, sickly, unbearable. For weeks, Boston would stink of molasses. Some claimed the scent lingered for decades, carried on the winds, seeping from the cracks of cobblestones. The questions begin. According to official records, the disaster was the result of negligence. An unsafe tank, a warm day, pressure, heat, and carelessness. A tragedy, but no mystery. Yet the more one looks into the archives, the stranger it becomes. The tank had survived years of pressure before. Why did it collapse on that particular day? Why did internal memos vanish from company files? And why, in witness testimony, do so many claim to have heard not one explosion, but two? Some believed it was sabotage. The First World War had ended only weeks before. Anarchists, angry at USIA's profits and the government's use of ethanol for weapons, had planted bombs across the United States in the preceding years. Could the tank have been deliberately destroyed? The official inquiry dismissed the theory. Yet in private notes, Judge Hugh Ogden, who presided over the case, admitted certain evidence is missing. The possibility of hostile action can't be entirely ruled out. Some believe the truth was buried to protect corporate and government interests. Others insist the molasses itself had fermented, creating a buildup of carbon dioxide and alcohol that turned the tank into a bomb. What really happened that day in 1919? And why does the Evidence See Chapter 100 closing Boston buried its dead, scrubbed its streets, and tried to erase the nightmare of January 15th? But questions remained, festering beneath the sticky surface. The Great Molasses Flood was over, or had it only just begun? Part 2, The Investigation. In the days after the flood, Boston resembled a battlefield. Rescuers moved through streets coated in syrup, cutting through hardened sludge with axes. They pulled survivors from the muck, sometimes only to discover that the person had suffocated moments earlier. Newspapers ran lurid headlines. Molasses floods Boston streets, scores injured, dead. Photographs, grainy and unsettling, showed shattered houses and broken bodies carried out on the stretchers. The immediate reaction from the United States Industrial Alcohol Company was denial. Their lawyers insisted that the tank had been properly maintained. The weather, they claimed, had been too warm. The molasses had fermented, causing pressure to rise beyond expectation. It was, in their words, an act of God. But the people of Boston disagreed. And within weeks, one of the largest legal battles in American history was set into motion. Survivors' voices. Testimonies collected at the time paint a chilling picture. A firefighter named George Leahy told investigators, "The molasses caught me up and threw me. I felt it pull at my boots, hold me down, as if hands were dragging me into the earth. I heard the cries of horses and men, and then silence." Another survivor, a child named Anthony DeStasio, was swept nearly a block away. He recalled later, "I was in a little boat of molasses being carried. I heard my mother screaming. I couldn't see. I couldn't breathe. Then someone pulled me up, and there was air again." But among the testimonies were details that did not fit the simple story of a structural failure. Several witnesses swore they heard not one explosion, but two. A smaller one, like a gunshot, followed by the massive rupture of the tank itself. A dock worker named Patrick Breen told police, "It sounded like a blast, not just the tank splitting. A bang, then the roar." Official records filed later by the Boston police make little mention of these statements. Some were quietly omitted from the published report. The legal storm, the case of Domenico Di Stasio et al. United States Industrial Alcohol Company, soon became the largest civil lawsuit in Massachusetts history up to that time. Over 100 separate suits were consolidated into one massive case. Families of the dead, injured survivors, and the city of Boston itself demanded compensation. The court appointed Judge Hugh W. Ogden to preside. Ogden was known as a man of strict order, loyal to the institutions of law and government. Yet as he examined the case, even he grew uneasy. For more than 3 years, the hearings dragged on. More than 1,000 witnesses testified. Over 1,500 exhibits were introduced into evidence. Engineers, metallurgists, and architects debated the strength of the tank's steel. Survivors gave harrowing accounts. Company officials denied everything. In the courtroom, one fact was repeated again and again. The tank had leaked from the very beginning. Children had dipped cups into the streams of molasses running down its sides. Workers reported strange creaks and groans. Yet no serious repairs were ever made. Why? Because fixing the tank would have meant shutting down production. And with government contracts at stake, the company chose profit over safety. The evidence that didn't fit. But even as negligence became the dominant narrative, whispers of another possibility lingered. Anarchist bombings had plagued America during the 1910s. In 1916, a munitions plant in New Jersey exploded under mysterious circumstances, killing 7 and injuring over 100. In 1919, mail bombs were sent to officials across the country. The very same year as the Molasses flood, radicals detonated a bomb on Wall Street, killing 30 people. Boston itself had been a hotbed of anarchist activity. The Sacco and Vanzetti case, 2 Italian anarchists accused of murder, would soon grip the city. Could the Molasses tank have been a target? Company lawyers hinted at this theory in court, suggesting sabotage by anarchists who hated USIA's ties to the government. Newspapers picked it up, publishing headlines like, "Molasses tank bombed by radicals?" But the evidence was thin. Or was it hidden? Missing files. According to archivists who later examined the court records, certain documents appear to have vanished. An engineering report filed in 1916, which supposedly warned of the tank's poor design, was never entered into evidence. Notes from a Boston building inspector, the one who called the tank unsafe, were missing from the final court exhibits. Even more strange, police interviews with dock workers who claimed to have seen suspicious figures near the tank in the days before the disaster were never presented in court. Judge Ogden, in his private notes later discovered in his personal papers, wrote, "Certain testimonies have been excised. I cannot determine by whose authority why would evidence disappear. To protect USIA? To prevent panic over anarchist activity? Or was there a deeper collusion between government, industry, and law?" The verdict, after years of proceedings, Judge Ogden finally delivered his judgment in 1925. USIA was found liable. Negligence, poor construction, and lack of safety inspections had caused the disaster. The company was ordered to pay over $600,000 in damages, more than $9 million in today's currency. Families of victims received around $7,000 each. Injured survivors were granted lesser sums. It was one of the earliest cases in American history to hold a corporation accountable for mass death. But not everyone was satisfied. Some pointed out that the verdict neatly avoided assigning blame to the city of Boston, which had failed to properly inspect the tank. Others whispered that the anarchist theory had been deliberately buried to prevent panic or to protect the government's contracts with USIA. Officially, the case was closed. Unofficially, the questions never stopped. The haunting details. For years afterward, residents swore the North End was haunted by the flood. Children playing in the streets claimed they could still smell molasses in the summer heat. Firefighters said their hoses stuck to the cobblestones. Horses refused to walk near the old site of the tank. And in the archives of Boston newspapers, odd stories appeared. Letters to the editor from unnamed writers describing shadows moving near the tank in the nights before the collapse. Unconfirmed reports of men seen carrying satchels and tools along the waterfront. Police dismissed them as hysteria, but the letters vanished from official files. Even the death toll remains uncertain. Officially, 21 dead, but city workers quietly admitted that unregistered immigrants may have perished, their bodies never identified, their families too afraid to come forward. Some estimates place the number at closer to 30. Chapter 2. Closing. The legal battle ended. The company paid. The city moved on. But beneath the surface, something did not add up. Why were testimonies erased? Why were warnings ignored? And why did so many who lived through that day swear they heard not just a collapse, but an explosion? Some believe the truth was buried to protect the powerful. Others whisper of sabotage, of shadows in the night. According to official records, the Great Molasses flood was an accident, but sometimes official records are written to hide the truth. The story does not end here. Part 3. The Cleanup. When the floodwaters of Molasses subsided, Boston was left with a nightmare. Rescuers and residents faced not only destruction, but a cleanup effort unlike any the city had ever seen. 2.5 million gallons of sticky syrup coated every surface of the North End. Streets were buried under 2 feet of hardened sugar. Basements were filled to the ceiling. The harbor itself turned brown. Workers described the task as like shoveling glue. Steam shovels proved useless. Hoses failed, the water pressure too weak to cut through the syrup. Crews resorted to spreading sand and sawdust, scraping the mixture up with shovels and carting it away in wagons. The work lasted for weeks, then months. According to official city records, more than 87,000 man-hours were spent on the cleanup. Even then, the smell lingered. For decades, residents claimed that on hot summer days, the North End would sweat molasses again, the sickly sweetness rising from between the cracks of cobblestones. One newspaper editorial wrote grimly, "Boston will smell of molasses for the rest of our lives." Bodies in the syrup rescue workers made horrifying discoveries as they dug. In some houses, they found entire families trapped in molasses that had hardened like cement. Horses were found standing upright, their eyes frozen in terror, encased in dark sugar. A patrolman named Frank McManus later testified, "We pulled a man free, but his arm was gone. The molasses had taken the skin clean off, as though boiled autopsies confirmed what survivors already knew. Many victims did not drown. They suffocated slowly, lungs filled with syrup, every breath a struggle until silence came." But here lies another unsettling truth. Officially, 21 people were listed as dead. Yet several accounts mention additional bodies, never identified, carried quietly to paupers' graves. A firefighter, interviewed years later, admitted, "There were more than they told. Men with no names, no families, gone in the syrup. Nobody counted them." Some believe the city deliberately underreported the death toll to control panic and minimize liability. If true, the official number, 21, may be only part of the story. The city's shame, Boston, prided itself on order, progress, and industry. But the flood was an embarrassment on the world stage. Foreign newspapers mocked the tragedy, calling it a symbol of American greed. The Boston Globe wrote, "Our city has drowned in sugar." Behind the sarcasm was humiliation. A modern metropolis had been brought to its knees, not by war, not by fire, but by negligence and syrup. City leaders moved quickly to bury the memory. The site of the tank was cleared, rebuilt, and erased from maps. Officials spoke less and less of the disaster. Within a few years, it was treated as a curiosity, a joke, a piece of folklore. But in private file, city engineers continued to exchange memos. They warned of poor construction standards, of corporations cutting corners, of the danger of ignoring inspections. These documents, some marked confidential, were sealed away. Why seal them? Why keep secret the warnings that might have prevented future tragedies? Some argue it was to protect Boston's reputation. Others suspect deeper collusion between industry and government, a willingness to hide the truth to safeguard profit. The science of failure. In later years, metallurgists studied fragments of the tank. Their findings were damning. The steel used was too thin, only half an inch in most places. Worse, it lacked sufficient manganese, a chemical element that prevents brittleness. The result was metal that could shatter like glass under stress. Rivets had been improperly installed, leaving holes that acted as weak points. An engineer concluded the tank was doomed from the day it was built. And yet, it stood for 4 years before collapsing. It withstood winters, summers, shipments, and pressure. Why did it fail on January 15, 1919, and not earlier? Some point to the sudden rise in temperature that morning. Others to fermentation inside the tank, producing gas. But conspiracy theories continue to thrive. Witnesses swore they heard an explosion before the rupture. Could fermentation alone have caused such a sound? Or was something else at work? The anarchist shadow. The year 1919 was one of upheaval. The first Red Scare gripped America. Strikes, riots, and anarchist bombings shook the nation. Fear of radicals was everywhere. In April 1919, just 3 months after the flood, anarchists mailed 36 bombs to government officials and businessmen across the country. In June, they detonated bombs in several cities, including Washington, D.C. One nearly killed the Attorney General of the United States. Boston was not immune. Radical meetings were held in the very neighborhoods that the Molasses flood destroyed. Italian anarchists, many of them poor, embittered immigrants, openly spoke against corporations and government. It is within this context that rumors spread. The Molasses tank had been targeted. Police files, partly declassified decades later, mention suspicious individuals near the waterfront in the nights before the disaster. But the details are vague. Names were never recorded, or perhaps they were erased. If sabotage occurred, it was covered up. Why? Some historians argue that authorities feared public panic. Others believe the company and the government wanted to avoid admitting how vulnerable America's industries were to attack. The silence of the archives. Researchers digging through archives in the 1970s found curious gaps. Entire boxes of evidence from the Ogden hearings were missing. Some witness testimonies were absent, though they had been referenced in newspapers of the time. One archivist, interviewed anonymously, said, "It is as if the record was cleaned." As though someone wanted the story to be simple. An accident, nothing more. Even Judge Ogden's private papers contain hints of unease. In one handwritten note, he confessed, "Certain testimonies excised. I am troubled by the omission, but powerless to object. Was Ogden pressured? Was evidence destroyed? The questions remain. Lingering ghosts." For years after, the flood became legend. Children whispered of hearing cries in the night near the old tank site. Families swore that on humid evenings, the air still smelled of sugar and death. One Boston policeman claimed that horses refused to walk down Commercial Street for years, shying away as if they remembered. Even into the 1960s, old residents would lower their voices when speaking of the flood. They would say, "It wasn't just an accident, but best not to talk about it." What did they mean? Did they know more than they admitted? Or had the horror of that day simply left a stain too deep to be spoken aloud? Chapter 3. Closing the flood was cleaned. The lawsuits settled. The city rebuilt. But silence lingered, heavy and suffocating, like the syrup that once drowned its streets. Officially, it was negligence. Unofficially, it may have been something else entirely. And as the decades passed, the Great Molasses Flood did not fade away. Instead, it became a ghost story, one with secrets still buried in the archives of Boston. The question remains, was the tank destroyed by time and carelessness, or by the hidden hand of men? The answer lies not only in what was written, but in what was erased. Part 4. The Long Memory. Boston changed after the flood. The city repaired its streets, rebuilt its homes, and buried its dead. Yet the disaster left behind more than destruction. It left an atmosphere, a lingering unease, a sense that something had been concealed. Survivors rarely spoke of what they had seen. Families who lost loved ones avoided the subject altogether. It was too painful, too grotesque. One woman who lived through it told a reporter in the 1950s, "We don't talk about the syrup. It killed people we knew. We prefer silence." And yet the flood was not forgotten. Instead, it slipped into Boston's collective subconscious. A story repeated in hushed tones, half folklore, half nightmare. Children born decades after the event heard warnings from their elders. Don't walk too close to the harbor. The ground remembers. Some claim the smell of sugar lingered for nearly a century. Others said on hot nights the cobblestones of Commercial Street sweated molasses again. Perhaps these were exaggerations, or perhaps they were something more. A haunting reminder that history does not simply vanish when ordered to. The lawsuit that changed industry. The lawsuits that followed the disaster stretched on for 6 years. They became the longest civil trial in Massachusetts history up to that point. More than 3,000 claims were filed against the United States Industrial Alcohol Company. The hearings filled thousands of pages of testimony. Engineers, survivors, city inspectors, and company officials all took the stand. Judge Hugh Ogden presided, listening to every word. His final ruling was damning. He concluded that USCA had been negligent. The tank had been poorly designed, poorly constructed, and never properly tested. The company was ordered to pay nearly $1 million in damages, the equivalent of over $17 million today. But the trial did something more. It established the principle that corporations could be held accountable for public safety. According to legal historians, the Molasses flood trial laid groundwork for modern industrial regulation. Without it, later safety codes for construction, food storage, and infrastructure might not exist. And yet, even this triumph of justice carried shadows. For many in Boston, the verdict came too late. As one survivor put it, "What is $1 million to the dead?" Memory and silence. By the mid-20th century, the flood had faded from the headlines. It survived only in fragments, anecdotes, whispers, brief articles buried deep in the back pages of newspapers. Some historians argue this was deliberate. Boston's civic leaders wanted to project an image of progress, not tragedy. To dwell on the flood was to dwell on failure. But silence has a way of deepening mystery. With each year that passed, the event became stranger in the public imagination. Were there really more dead than reported? Had anarchists struck the tank? Why had so many records gone missing? The less people were told, the more they speculated. Folklore and haunting. The Molasses flood became a kind of ghost story in Boston's North End. Children dared each other to run down the old tank site after dark. They whispered of phantom footsteps sloshing behind them, as if something heavy still dragged through the syrup. An elderly man interviewed in 1964 recalled, "You'd hear crying sometimes at night, but when you went to look, the street was empty. My mother said it was the flood calling." There were also stranger tales. A firefighter's grandson claimed that his grandfather confessed to retrieving more bodies than reported, and that some were never buried in marked graves. Instead, they were carted off quietly, their identities unknown. If true, it would explain the voices people swore they heard near Copp's Hill burying ground, the cries of those uncounted, lost to syrup and silence. Skeptics dismiss such stories as urban legend. But in the eerie atmosphere of the North End, where narrow streets still twist like labyrinths, such legends find fertile soil. Rediscovery. It was not until the 1970s that scholars began to revisit the flood seriously. Journalists uncovered fragments of testimony long ignored. Historians pressed for access to sealed documents, and survivors, now elderly, finally began to speak. One of them, a woman named Florence Jones, gave a chilling interview in 1978. She had been 8 years old when the flood struck. She described watching her neighbor, an old man, trapped in molasses up to his chest. "He begged us to pull him out," she said, "but every time we tried, it took the skin off his arms. He screamed, and then he went under." I can still hear him. Her account matched reports from 1919, but had never been published in such detail. Why? Had it been too disturbing? Or had someone chosen not to record it? The rediscovery of these memories revived interest in the flood. Suddenly, it was no longer just a quirky historical footnote. It was a tragedy of industrial negligence, human suffering, and unanswered questions. Science looks again. In the 2000s, engineers at Harvard and MIT conducted new studies of the disaster. Using modern physics, they created computer models of the flood. Their simulations confirmed the terror described by witnesses. A wave of molasses moving at 35 miles per hour, carrying a force of more than 2 million gallons. The models showed how the syrup's density made it deadlier than water, dragging people down instantly, crushing bones. One engineer remarked, "It would have felt like drowning in cement." The studies also confirmed the steel had been fatally flawed, but they raised other questions too. For instance, some models showed that fermentation alone could not have created enough pressure to cause such a sudden and catastrophic failure. So what, then, tipped the balance? Was it simply temperature? Was it sabotage? Or something else, lost to time? Conspiracy Revisited. The theory of sabotage has never fully died. Some researchers point to inconsistencies in witness statements. Several people swore they heard a sharp blast, like dynamite, just before the tank ruptured. Others described flames, though no fire was ever officially reported. Skeptics argue these were simply the sounds of rivets popping, steel tearing. But in the atmosphere of 1919, with anarchists planting bombs across the country, suspicion was inevitable. Recently unearthed police notes from 1919 mention an Italian laborer who claimed to have seen men carrying packages near the tank one evening. His testimony was dismissed at the time as unreliable. But why? Was it truly worthless? Or was it suppressed to prevent panic? Historians remain divided. Some believe the flood was exactly what Judge Ogden declared: corporate negligence, nothing more. Others argue that the missing files, the undercounted bodies, and the suspicious testimonies point toward a darker explanation, one Boston never wanted revealed. Cultural echoes. In recent decades, the Molasses flood has entered popular culture. Books, plays, and even songs retell the tragedy. Tour guides point to the site, weaving both history and legend. But for the families who lost loved ones, the event is no mere curiosity. Descendants still gather each year to remember. They speak of parents and grandparents who never recovered from the trauma, who carried nightmares until death. A grandson of one victim said in 2014, "We were told it was an accident, but my grandmother said otherwise. She said, 'They lied to us. Don't trust the papers.'" Such statements blur the line between memory and conspiracy. Yet they remind us of an essential truth. When official explanations leave gaps, people fill them with their own stories. And sometimes those stories feel more real than history itself. Closing of Part 4. The Great Molasses Flood is remembered today as both tragedy and curiosity, a disaster both absurd and horrifying. But beneath the surface of sticky folklore lies something deeper: the silence of survivors, the missing documents, the rumors of sabotage, the whispers of uncounted dead. Boston rebuilt, but it never fully explained. And as long as questions remain unanswered, the flood cannot rest entirely in the past. What truly burst that tank? And why do the archives of Boston still tremble with secrets? Part 5. The Lasting Shadow. The flood had ended in 1919. The dead were buried. The lawsuits were settled. The streets of Boston were washed, scraped, and rebuilt. But the story of the Great Molasses Flood refused to vanish. For more than a century, it has seeped through the cracks of history, at times a dark joke, at times a serious tragedy, and at times something else entirely: a mystery. The folklore of disaster. When people remember disasters, they often remember fire or storm or earthquake. These are natural forces, grand and familiar. But molasses? That was something unnatural, something absurd. And perhaps that absurdity made the flood all the more terrifying. Teachers told it to children as a cautionary tale. Tourists laughed nervously when hearing of Boston drowning in syrup. Yet beneath the uneasy laughter, there was always a shiver. Because behind the comedy was horror. Men and women suffocating, bones broken, lungs filled with sugar. One local writer described it best: "It was not death by water, nor by fire, but by sweetness turned cruel." It was death that mocked us, the human ghosts. What of the survivors? Many lived long lives, but they carried scars both visible and invisible. A boy named Pasquale Iantosca lost his sister in the flood. For decades afterward, he could not walk near the waterfront without shaking. Another survivor, a woman who was 15 at the time, later told her daughter, "I cannot eat syrup. I cannot even smell it. It makes me think of the screams such memories were rarely written down." They survived in families, in whispers across dinner tables, in the stories grandchildren repeated with a mixture of awe and dread. Boston was rebuilt in brick and stone, but inside the minds of those who lived through it, the North End remained forever sticky, forever echoing with cries for help. The gaps in the record historians who revisit the disaster encounter a problem. Not only were many records lost, but some appear to have been deliberately removed. Files referenced in newspapers no longer exist in court archives. Police reports contain pages torn out. And even Judge Ogden's otherwise meticulous notes have missing sections. Why? Was it mere negligence in record-keeping, or something darker? One theory holds that Boston's civic leaders quietly purged the archives, hoping to erase evidence of negligence and incompetence. Another suggests that files relating to suspected anarchist sabotage were destroyed to prevent public panic. Whatever the reason, the result is the same. The official history is incomplete, and in the silence of those missing pages, conspiracy takes root. Uncounted dead. The official toll remains 21, but rumors persist that more perished. Transient workers, unnamed immigrants, people without family to claim them. Their bodies, some say, were pulled from the Molasses only to be buried quietly, their deaths unrecorded. A firefighter years later told his grandson, "There were faces I still see at night. They're not in the papers, but they were there." If true, it means the disaster was even more deadly than history admits. It means that beneath the surface of official statistics lies a second hidden tragedy, the erasure of the nameless. Sabotage or negligence? The question lingers. Was the tank simply doomed? Flawed steel, careless design, and nothing more? Or was it brought down by deliberate hands? The timing was suspicious. Boston was a hotbed of anarchist activity in 1919. Explosions shook American cities that very year. The Italian anarchist movement had roots in the North End, the very community drowned in syrup. And yet no group ever claimed responsibility. No manifesto surfaced. No confession was made. Instead, the official explanation became corporate negligence, an answer both logical and convenient. Convenient for the company which paid damages and closed the book. Convenient for the city which avoided panic. Convenient for the government which avoided admitting how fragile its industries truly were. But convenience is not the same as truth, and perhaps the truth lies somewhere between a failing tank pushed to the edge by design flaws and a final nudge from hands unseen. The place today. The North End of Boston is no longer a place of tragedy. It is a neighborhood of restaurants, bakeries, tourists, and children playing in narrow streets. But if you know where to look, you can still find the shadow. On Commercial Street, near where the tank once stood, a plaque quietly marks the disaster. Most passers-by never notice it. And yet on certain summer days, locals still insist they can smell something faint in the air. A sweetness that does not belong. A smell that seems to rise from the ground itself, from cracks between the cobblestones, from somewhere deep below the earth. Is it memory? Is it imagination? Or is it something more tangible, the last breath of molasses still seeping through the soil over 100 years later? The haunting disasters linger not just in ruins, but in memory. The Great Molasses Flood is one of those tragedies that seems to resist burial. It clings like the syrup itself, sticky and impossible to wash away. It is remembered in laughter, in horror, in conspiracy, in silence. It is remembered in the nightmares of survivors and in the theories of historians. It is remembered in the smell that old residents swear still drifts on the air. It is a reminder that progress is fragile, that negligence kills, and that the truth, the whole truth, is sometimes hidden beneath layers as thick as molasses. Closing reflections. According to official records, the Great Molasses Flood was an industrial accident caused by greed, ignorance, and poor engineering. But what happened next defies logic. Missing documents, unexplained explosions, rumors of sabotage, uncounted dead, all suggest that the official story is only part of the truth. Some believe the real story was buried forever, hidden in archives destroyed, in testimonies erased. Others believe the flood itself has become a ghost, haunting Boston as a warning that the past cannot always be contained. The city has moved on, but the ground remembers, the harbor remembers, and perhaps the dead remember too. Final words. The Great Molasses Flood was not just a freak accident, it was a disaster born of hubris, concealed by silence and remembered in whispers. And like the syrup that smothered Boston streets, the truth remains. Heavy, dark, and impossible to fully escape.